Welcome to your lecture on leasehold conveyancing, and leasehold conveyancing is going to be dealt with over 2 lectures, and in this lecture, the first one, we're going to be looking at the grant of a new lease. And in the second lecture, we'll be looking at a transaction where there is a lease in existence already, and that lease is being assigned to a new buyer. So in terms of a lease itself, just to recap to you what a lease actually is, it's an agreement by which an estate in land or property is created, but only for a finite term. So it's a way of owning that land, but for a set period, and that can be for minutes, if you like, or hours, weeks, months, or years, decades even. Now, in the context of property law and practice, we're going to be concentrating on a long lease of a residential flat, rather than a short lease, where you would perhaps take ownership for maybe 6 months or a year, or commercial property, where again, there are a lot shorter leases. Now, due to the length of residential leases, their content can differ to that you would find in a commercial lease. So we are purely going to be concentrating on a residential lease, and we're talking a long lease, so at least sort of 100 years plus. Now, in terms of acting for both landlord and tenant, you would obviously have to consider the professional conduct rules on conflicts of interest, and it's fair to say that a conflict would arise if you were to act on behalf of both a landlord and a tenant in the same transaction, due to the fact that their interests differ greatly. So, for example, a landlord would require clauses in a lease that protect their reversionary interest, so their title being the freehold, and they would want to impose a long list of covenants on a tenant, restricting really what they can do and cannot do at the property. Landlords also want to give themselves a right of re-entry to the property so that they can go in certain circumstances. Now, a tenant would also require covenants in the lease, but they would be completely opposite to what the landlord wants. They're going to want to limit the number of covenants imposed on themselves, but they're also going to want certain covenants imposed on the landlord. So it's not possible for one conveyancer in a transaction to act on behalf of both parties. There's just too much of a conflict of interests. So as I say, we're going to be concentrating today on the grant of a new lease, and first of all, we're going to consider what the benefits for a landlord are when they actually grant a lease of their premises. Well, the benefits can be varied, but one of the main benefits is that on the granting of the lease, the landlord gets to charge the tenant not only the rent per annum, but also a premium, so if you like, a purchase price for the granting of that lease. Now, depending on the area that the property is in and the property itself that's concerned, that could be very substantial. So a lot of people think that flats, leases, are not worth as much as freeholds, but that's not the case at all. Depending on where that property is, the purchase price for a flat could be just as much as a freehold, possibly even more. So that means the landlord stands to make a reasonable lump sum, a good sort of profit, if you like, on the granting of that lease. Now, they also then get the rent, yearly rent, in respect of that lease, but just be aware that in residential leases, rents are not very high, so per annum it may be a very nominal amount that the landlord continues to get. Now, whilst the landlord is effectively selling the property to create an interest for somebody else, that leasehold interest, as I said, is only for a finite period. So that means the landlord retains an interest in the property by way of still owning the freehold. That means, because they have an interest in the property, they can still deal with that interest. So, for example, they could sell that freehold to somebody else if they wanted to. And another benefit is about enforcing positive covenants. So the landlord can do this through the lease. They can actually enforce positive covenants on the property's title and the ones that are in the lease. And what that means is that they have a degree of control over the property and the tenant by being able to do that. Now, in terms of acting for the landlord, on the grant of a new lease, the landlord's solicitor will draft a contract, and they will send the draft contract for approval to the tenant's solicitor. They will also draft the lease itself, and they will send that with the contract, and the lease will be attached to the contract so that you know what form of lease has been agreed and that all of the terms are agreed as attached to the contract itself. Now, in terms of the lease, whether it can be amended, once the landlord solicitors have drafted it, the tenant solicitor can amend the lease and send it back to the landlord solicitor. Again, they can re-amend it if they want to, and return it back and so on, and it's a point of negotiation. And that travelling draft lease will pass between the two sets of solicitors until the final form is agreed. Now, just be aware that if you're acting for a tenant, there may be a very limited number of amendments that you can make on behalf of a tenant to that lease, so you as the tenant solicitors. In particular, if there are a number of leases involved in respect of a property. So, to give you an example, if there is a block of flats, the landlord owns the freehold, and they are granting a number of leases to different people, so each tenant is getting a flat, and they are taking a brand new lease of that flat, then in that instance, the tenant solicitor will be very limited as to the amendments that they can make in respect of the leases, because all of those leases, in respect of that same block of flats, need to be identical. So, once a lease has been agreed, say with the first tenant, if you're like the second, third, fourth tenant coming in, you probably won't be able to make any amendments to that lease because it has to be identical to that first lease that has already been granted. So it very much depends on the situation as to what amendments can be made by a tenant solicitor, how many leases there are, where you are in the transaction in terms of whether you're the first tenant coming in or a later one. So it's just something to be aware of. Now, standard condition 8.2 is relevant here. Standard condition 8.2.3 states that the lease is to be in the form of the draft attached to the agreement. So that just sort of reiterates the points about the draft lease being attached to the contract. In respect of a new long lease, nothing needs to be added regarding deduction of title, because standard condition 8.2.4 states that if the term of the new lease will exceed 7 years, the seller is to deduce a title which will enable the buyer to register the lease at Her Majesty's Land Registry with an absolute title. So where we're using standard conditions, that means the seller has to deduce the superior title, so like the freehold if you like, so that the lease that's being granted can be registered at the Land Registry and it can get absolute title. Now, in terms of drafting the lease, the main provisions of the lease will include all the details about the parties, the property that's being leased to the tenant, and any property being retained by the seller. The lease will include rights to both the seller, so the landlord, and the buyer, and covenants will be entered into by both parties for the other's benefit, and possibly also for the benefit of others in the block of flats if that's the situation that you've got. In terms of the term of the lease, you can see there on the slide, it says not less than 60 to 85 years as a starting point. Now, the reason that we have that minimum period on there is to do with lenders. So lenders will nearly always insist that there is at least 60 years on the term of the lease. Some lenders now are actually increasing that time frame and saying that we want a minimum of maybe up to 85 years on that lease. if the lease is granted with less than a minimum term to run on that property, then what that means is the property effectively becomes unmortgageable. Because if all lenders, as a bottom line, say there must be at least 60 years on the term, and there's a lease there of, say, 55 years on the term, then you're not going to find any lender that will give a mortgage over that property. So it becomes unmortgageable, and as a result, really, that lease then becomes unsellable in terms of the future. Now, as to each lender's minimum term requirements, as a solicitor, you can have a look at the UK Finance Mortgage Lenders Handbook, and that will tell you, for all of the different lenders, what their minimum term requirements are. Because of this being 60 years, as you can probably now imagine, when you're looking at a long residential lease being granted, that's why you're probably looking at a very minimum, it being granted for maybe like 125 years, but perhaps actually the lease might be granted for like 999 years, so it's got a long time left to run on it. Another important consideration when drafting the lease is to think about the easements that need to be drafted in favour of the property and the tenant, but also the exceptions and reservations that need to be drafted in favour of the landlord, so in favour of the seller, to ensure that they can still do as they want to over the property in respect of any retained land they may have. Now, in addition, the landlord will need to ensure that all of the correct rights have been accepted and reserved over the property for the benefit of other properties. So again, if you have that block of flats, it's not just a question of the landlord reserving rights for themselves, but also for everybody else in that block if they need, for example, access to this flat. Now, under the Land Registration, Amendment Number 2 Rules 2005, certain lease contents must be in a particular position in registrable leases, and these are called prescribed clause leases. Under Rule 58A, and that's capital A prescribed clause lease must begin with the required wording, or that wording must appear immediately after any front sheet. A prescribed clause lease is any lease that's granted on or after the 19th of June 2006, where the term triggers compulsory registration. So in other words, the term is over 7 years. Now, bearing in mind, we're talking here about long residential leases, so any lease we're talking about here is going to be registered at the Land Registry. Now, alongside the contract and the lease, the landlord solicitor will also need to send evidence of the freehold title, and I'll come back to that more shortly. And also the leasehold property information form, where relevant, which the landlord will have completed. So it may well be that some of that information is relevant on the grant of a new lease, some of it may not be as yet. But that's very much something we'll come back to when we look at the assignment of an existing lease, the leasehold property information form. It's also important to remember that if there's a mortgage on the freehold, then the lender's consent is going to need to be obtained in relation to the granting of this lease, and it's a good idea to try and get that as soon as possible. The lender may actually want to approve the final version of the lease as well. And where there's a management company going to be involved, then the memorandum and articles of association of that company will need to be sent to the tenant solicitor, so they can really just ensure that the company has the powers that they need in order to manage the property effectively. What we'll do now is we'll have a look at some common covenants within the lease, and think about sort of what the content needs to be and how they affect that property. Just before we do that, just to mention the Landlord and Tenant Covenants Act 1995 to you. Now, this act changed the position on liability for covenants in leases and their enforcement. Prior to this act coming in, the original landlord and the original tenant of the lease would be liable to each other under the covenants in that lease for the full term of the lease. Now that was regardless of whether the tenant had assigned, so if you like transferred, the residue of the lease term to a new tenant. So to give you an example, if you had a lease for 125 years and the tenant after 5 years of living at the property decided to sell the lease to somebody else, the tenant would still remain liable for that entire term under those covenants, even though they're no longer the tenant. Now, that was extremely unfair on the original tenant because they could be sued for rent arrears of the current tenant in there, so the existing tenant, even if they themselves haven't been the tenant for many years. They may not know who that tenant is that's living in the property. They may not have been there for 25, 30, 40 years, but they could still be sued for that person's rent arrears because they happened to be the original tenant of that lease. Now, the 1995 Act brought about a change to this, but the provisions of the Act only apply to leases created on or after the 1st of January 1996. So any leases that are created after that date, we generally refer to them as new leases, and before that date as old leases, just to distinguish between the two. Because of the Act, a tenant who assigns their lease, so a new lease, is automatically released from any continuing liability under the lease covenants. So it's changed the rule, if you like, as to liability. Now, landlords, if they wanted to, could still keep tenants, we call it sort of on the hook, keep them liable by requesting them to enter into something called an authorised guarantee agreement. And that is where the tenant is guaranteeing the performance of the covenants by their immediate successor. Now, it is just their immediate successor, so once that tenant assigns the lease, the original tenant is off the hook, if you like. The requirements, though, to enter into this authorised guarantee agreement, we call it an AGA, is that the lease must state, to begin with, that is a requirement. And the only other thing I'd really say on this, because we're not going to get too much more into this, is that AGAs are much more common in commercial leases, and so not something we come across very often in residential, but it's just something to be aware of. In terms of how the Act affects landlords, they are not automatically released from their liability when they transfer their title, so like the freehold. They have to ask to be released by the tenant, but there is an option to obviously get out of that situation and release their liability. So that just gives you a bit of background, really, about the 1995 Act. In terms of common covenants, then, rent, obviously, is very essential. So a covenant by the tenant to pay rent should appear in all leases where the landlord wants there to be a rental obligation. In terms of rent, that may also be defined to include insurance premium contributions and any service charge that's payable. So service charge I'll come on to in a second when I talk more about repair, so what that actually means. Now, to include those definitions is a benefit to the landlord because they can be recovered then, those contributions, as arrears of rent rather than as a result of a breach of covenant. The lease will normally state that rent is to be payable in advance, failing which it will be payable in arrears. It's usually paid quarterly, and the modern payment dates are 1st of January, 1st of April, 1st of July and 1st of October. The traditional payment dates, which can also be used, are 25th of March, 24th of June, 29th of September and 25th of December. You might also find provisions in the lease relating to rent review, so when that's to take place and when the revised rent is payable from. And the tenant, in relation to rent, will want a provision in the lease that suspends the rent payments if the property is destroyed or damaged by an insured risk. Now, in terms of repair, the covenants relating to repair can be difficult for a couple of reasons. First, because deciding on which parts of the property must be repaired by the tenant depends on the extent of the definition of the tenant's property. And secondly, once the extent of the property is known, the measure of the burden of the repairing liability must be decided. So this could range really from simple repairs, dealing with things like wear and tear, to the tenant being under an obligation to almost replace the whole building. So you've got to decide sort of where in that parameter the tenant's liability should fall. Now, for properties with multiple tenants in them, so like multiple occupation, so like the block of flats that I've been referring to, it's common for the tenants to be responsible to keep in good repair what we call the inner skin of their demised property. So what we mean by the inner skin is things like the plaster of the walls, the floor and the ceiling. So what you can visually see when you stand in the flat itself. Nothing beyond that, so nothing structural, if you like. And the landlord then is to repair the outside of the building, so any elements, structural elements of the building, and also they're responsible for the common areas, so the common parts. Now, if that is the case, and I say that's the most common way that we would deal with a block of flats, so that essentially you have one person, the landlord, who is responsible for the structure of that building. They will be responsible for the repair of that, but they're not going to pay for it. It's for the tenants to pay. So what the tenants do is they pay for those repairs carried out by the landlord by way of a service charge. So you make a contribution towards those repairs. Now, in terms of the standard of repair, in the case of Proudfoot and Hart, it was held that the standard of repair was to be determined according to several factors, including the property's age and character and its environment. So that's just something to be aware of. Now, in terms of the landlord wanting to know what kind of state the properties are in, nearly all leases will allow the landlord to enter the property, so the tenant's property, to view the state of repair of that property. And if necessary, they can serve a notice on the tenant requiring them to repair the property if they're in breach of their repairing covenant. Now, if they do that, and the repair isn't then carried out by the tenant, then what the landlord can do is that they can actually carry out the repairs themselves, and of course charge the tenant the cost of doing so. So again, it's a degree of control to make sure the repairs are being carried out as they should be. In terms of alterations, the landlord will want to make sure that unauthorised alterations don't take place in the property, and in particular that any alterations the tenant does do don't affect the structure of the property or its value. Now, tenants of long leases like this are going to want to make some changes or additions to the property. It's highly unlikely when you're taking a lease of, say, 100 years, and you might be living there for 30, 40 years, or even less than that, maybe even just like 2 or 3 years, that you're going to want to make some changes to that property. Where we have long leases like this, if there was an absolute bar on any alterations, additions, or improvements to the property at all, that would be very unfair. So the lease should be, as we call it, qualified to allow the tenant to carry out non-structural alterations that, for example, don't affect load-bearing walls, timbers, that kind of thing. Very often, that qualified covenant will state that such non-structural alterations can be carried out only with the landlord's consent. Now, where proposed alterations amount to improvements, Section 19, subsection 2 of the Landlord and Tenant Act 1927 will apply, so that the landlord's consent cannot be unreasonably withheld. So where it says those non-structural alterations are to be carried out with the landlord's consent, that statute adds in what we call a test of reasonableness, and so the landlord then cannot unreasonably withhold that consent. The landlord also cannot demand any payment beyond their reasonable legal and other expenses incurred in granting that consent. Now, to avoid a dispute between the parties as to what amounts to an improvement, the alterations clause should always be drafted to include a fully qualified covenant, with the test of reasonableness being expressly added in. So in other words, the clause should say something like, the tenant may carry out non-structural alterations that don't affect any load-bearing walls or timbers with the landlord's consent, such consent not to be unreasonably withheld, so that you don't have that debate then about whether the statute will apply or not. If there is alterations done, the landlord can require the property to be reinstated at the end of the term if that alteration does not add to the property's letting value, or they can request a reasonable sum if the alterations decrease the value of the property itself. So by reinstatement, I mean putting the property back to how it was before the alterations were done. In terms of user, it's unusual to allow a tenant in this situation to use a property for anything other than residential use. So normally, residential leases like this contain a covenant barring the tenant from changing the use of that property from residential, so from the use granted in the lease. It's much obviously more desirable that all of the properties, say in a block of flats, only have one permitted use that can't be changed. Now, if we do that, it means all the tenants will have the same use, and we'll also make sure that there's no breaches of planning law as well, because likely, as I say, it's going to be residential use only. The clause may just say that it's for residential use and leave it at that. Tenants should resist if the clause says that the property is to be an occupation of one family only, because that's a bit too restrictive. Instead, maybe request a clause if the landlord sort of insists on limiting the number of people there. Say instead that the clause should be something like the property is not to be overcrowded, or it's not to be occupied by more than a certain number of people. But as I say, you may just get to the point where it's just residential use only, and there's no comment on who can live there. If the landlord's consent is required for a change of use, then under Section 19, subsection 3 of the Landlord and Tenant Act 1927, the landlord cannot demand a premium or extra rent for giving that consent. The only thing they can ask for is their costs. Now, insurance can be dealt with in one of two ways. Firstly, the tenant can covenant to insure the property, or secondly, more commonly I would say, the landlord will agree to insure the property. The reason it's more common for the landlord to insure is that's really the only way you can make sure that the property is insured satisfactorily, where you've got a building with multiple tenants in it. Because if the landlord does the insurance, the whole building will be covered by one policy, rather than if you have individual tenants doing it, you'd have to make sure really that all of those policies sort of match, tie together, and obviously it's very difficult to insure structurally different elements of the building under different policies. Where the landlord does do the insurance, as I say, you've got that one policy and that one payment, so under the lease, all of the tenants will covenant to pay a contribution of the insurance premium. In return, the tenant will want a covenant from the landlord that they will use any monies that are received under the insurance policy towards reinstating the premises if there's any sort of damage or destruction, and if there's a shortfall of insurance money, that the landlord will make up that shortfall out of their own pocket. That's a good way of ensuring that the landlord will insure the property really for the right sum in the first place. Tenants should also have a clause requesting the landlord to give them a copy of the policy and the last premium paid, so that you can see the terms of the policy and also that the premium has been paid, so the insurance in force. And the covenant to insure by the landlord should state that the policy will be for the full reinstatement value of the building. So if the building is destroyed, that the policy will pay out enough money to actually reinstate it, and you would also want to see a complete list of the insured risks that that policy is going to cover. In terms of alienation then, what we mean by alienation relates to what the tenant can do with the property in terms of assigning it to somebody else, so transferring it, subletting the property, mortgaging the property, and any other what we call material dealings with the property. Now, as a general principle, there's no restriction against alienation unless the lease expressly states that there is. In respect of long residential leases like this, a tenant should be able to deal with the property freely as if they owned the freehold. Clearly, if you're going to take out a lease for 100 years plus, you're going to want at some point to be able to assign that lease, so transfer that lease to somebody else, because with the best will in the world, you are not going to be there, highly unlikely you're going to be there for sort of 100 years plus, and circumstances change. And also to be able to do things like mortgage it if you want to, or sublet it if you want to, because you want that flat as an investment, but you don't want to live in it yourself, so you want to sublet to someone else. Now, because of this, because obviously long residential leases, we want the tenant to be able to deal with that property pretty freely, the majority of leases provide for a qualified covenant that the tenant must not assign the lease without the landlord's prior written consent, such consent not to be unreasonably withheld, and that is perfectly acceptable. And likewise, there may be a similar kind of covenant in relation to subletting or mortgaging. Under section 19(1) lowercase a of the Landlord and Tenant Act 1927, that piece of statute says that the consent is not to be unreasonably withheld if the covenant does not expressly provide for it. So in other words, if we have what we call that partially qualified covenant, where it says that the tenant cannot assign the property without the landlord's consent, but there's no mention of reasonableness, then that section 19(1)a, adds automatically that test of reasonableness in to say that the landlord cannot unreasonably withhold that consent. Now, some landlords may put a condition on giving their consent to something like an assignment or a subletting or a mortgage, and a perfectly reasonable condition of doing those things would be to give the landlord notice of that dealing on completion together with a fee, just so that they're aware of what's going on in the property. Under the Landlord and Tenant Act 1988, applications for assignments must be dealt with within a reasonable time by the landlord. Now, in terms of the Landlord and Tenant Covenants Act 1995, as I say, that's changed the provisions relating to liability for covenants and enforcement, and it may well be the case that a landlord would want an outgoing tenant, so a tenant that's assigning their lease to somebody else, to enter into one of those ARGAs that I mentioned, the Authorised Guarantee Agreement. But as I say, that is really much more common in commercial leases. Alternatively, another kind of condition that the landlord may put on is to say that the incoming tenant, the buyer, has to enter into a direct covenant with the landlord to observe all the terms and covenants of the lease while they're the tenant, and that is much more common that you'll come across that. In terms of quiet enjoyment then, a covenant for quiet enjoyment is given by the landlord for the benefit of the tenant and should really appear in all leases. If there isn't an express covenant, then an implied covenant will apply anyway. And what this basically means is that the tenant can enjoy the property without the landlord adversely disturbing their enjoyment, so they can use their property and enjoy it. Now, in terms of this mutual enforceability idea, a tenant will want a provision within the lease whereby the landlord will state that they will enforce covenants in other tenants' leases within the same building. And the terms under which the landlord will do that must be clearly set out in the lease. One of their terms, for example, will be that the costs are paid, so landlord's costs of doing this, of enforcing covenants against other tenants, will be paid. Now, the reason that we want a provision like this is because of limitations in privity of contracts in estate. Because the lease is between a landlord and a tenant, there is no provision for a tenant to directly enforce covenants of another tenant between them, because there's no contractual relationship between them. The only person who can enforce the covenants within that lease is the landlord. And the reason this can be a problem is because you may have a noisy neighbour, or you may have a neighbour that is making alterations to their property that they shouldn't, or using their property in a way that they shouldn't. So we have this idea that if one tenant in the block of flats goes to a landlord and says, the neighbour next door to me is breaching their covenants, can you enforce them, that the landlord will then do this. Now, that's one option of doing this. The other option, as well, or in addition, that you can do, is to put a clause within the leases, so the landlord puts a clause in, allowing mutual enforceability between the tenants themselves. So if that clause is there too, that means that the landlord is creating a relationship between the tenants and that they can enforce the covenants directly against each other. Now, in terms of the Contract Third Parties Act that you can see mentioned there, this idea of relationships and enforceability has been assisted in leases granted after the 11th of May 2000 because of the Contract Rights of Third Parties Act 1999. Under that Act, anybody with an interest affected by a covenant can enforce it. So it's the idea of creating that relationship. But one thing to be aware of is that Act is almost always excluded from leases. So it doesn't actually assist us, which is why we put these express provisions in instead. Now, other common provisions to be aware of, in terms of forfeiture, there will be an express provision for forfeiture of the lease where the tenant breaches any of the covenants, including not paying their rent. Now, forfeiture of a lease can only happen if there is an express provision providing for it. If there's no express provision in there, one is not implied. Be aware that in a residential lease, if there's a clause stating that there will be forfeiture of the lease on the tenant's bankruptcy, that is completely unacceptable. We do not like those clauses in residential leases because effectively it makes the lease unmortgageable, because the lender would immediately lose their security in the event the tenant became bankrupt. On that basis, if that clause is in there, no lender will loan against that lease, so the property is unmortgageable and therefore it's also unsellable in the future. Now, in terms of suspension of rent, the tenant will always want a clause in the lease saying that the rent is to be suspended where the property is destroyed or damaged by an insured risk. Simply, it wouldn't be fair for a tenant to pay rent on a property that they can't occupy or they can't use. Now, as a landlord, in that situation, would not receive any rent from the tenant, they may well insure for loss of rent, and the tenant, again, like they do with the buildings insurance premium, will contribute towards the cost of that insurance policy. In terms of service charge, as I say, where the landlord covenants to keep the property in good repair and condition, the cost of doing that will be recoverable from the tenants in that building. And I mentioned earlier that the service charge will cover things like repairs, that kind of thing. But the other kind of things that the tenants will have to pay for are things like lighting and heating of common areas. So if, stairwells, lift services, that kind of thing. And all of that forms part of the service charge. Now, the service charge will usually be stipulated in the lease to be payable at certain intervals. So again, things like the quarter days when the rent is payable. And quite often the amount may be decided by the landlord surveyor, whose decision is final, save in the case where they've made a manifest error. What happens is each year, at the end of the financial year, accounts are prepared showing the amount of service charge received and the exact cost of the services that have been provided. The other thing you may well come across is what's called a sinking fund, and that would cover the cost of major expenses, so things maybe like a boiler in the building, a roof repair, that kind of thing. The landlord's obligations into what services they are going to provide and how much the tenant is to contribute should be clearly identified in the lease. Now, under the Landlord and Tenant Act 1985, sections 18 to 30, some of the points that I just mentioned are covered by that statute. So, for example, section 19 imposes a requirement of reasonableness as to service charges, so as to how much the tenant should pay. Section 20 says that where there's going to be works carried out and the cost of the work exceeds £1,000, that two estimates must be obtained and notice given to the tenants. So just be aware that kind of elements of reasonableness when it comes to service charge are actually covered by statute. Now, the best way to avoid problems with service charges really is to state in the lease that the maintenance of the property, so the repairs, etc., are to be carried out by a management company. And what happens if a management company is created is that each tenant owns a share in that management company. Now, the result of that means that tenants can effectively control the services that are provided to them and the works that are carried out, and therefore, of course, they are in control of the amount of money that is being spent, so the expenditure incurred. It's not completely uncommon where you have something like a block of flats that on the sale of the last lease, so the sale of the last flat, that the landlord transfers the freehold title into the name of the management company. So they effectively sell off, grant all the leases, sell them all off, and then they transfer the freehold to the management company. And the tenants after that, through the company, then also own and control the freehold. And the reason that landlords may do that is because, as I said at the beginning of the lecture, the rents on these leases are very, very low. So the real money that landlords can make is on the granting of the lease, that initial purchase price that they sell it off for. So once they've done all of the leases and they've sold off all of the flats, there's no necessarily, in some situations, major benefit to hanging on and staying as the landlord. You end up doing a lot of the work to do the repairs for very little rent per year. So let's say that's not the case in all situations, but it is one possibility of the way that the freehold is dealt with. Now, you should just be aware of some main defects in long leases, so things that we do not like if you see them in a lease. Forfeiture on bankruptcy. Okay, I've already mentioned that. So if there's a provision providing for forfeiture on the lease of the tenant's bankruptcy, that makes it unmortgageable and so unsellable, so we don't want to see that in a long lease. If there's a prohibition against assignment of the whole, so in other words, you cannot transfer that whole lease to somebody else, that would be completely unacceptable because it means the tenant would never be able to sell the lease. So they should always be allowed to assign the whole. As I say, if that's with the landlord's consent, that's not deemed unreasonable. If there's inadequate provision for maintenance and repair of the structure, that would be a defect. So we need to make sure that the landlord has an obligation to repair the whole where that's the case, and that it is adequate provision, and we need an enforceable covenant to do that. Likewise, inadequate provision for the decoration of the outside as well would be covered there. So, as with maintenance and repair, the terms must be sufficient to allow tenants to enforce a covenant against the landlord to decorate the outside of the building. Quite simply because otherwise the exterior could fall into disrepair, and then it could affect the tenant's ability to sell their property, it could devalue it. If there's no mutual enforceability covenant, or an absence of a covenant by the landlord to enforce other tenants' covenants, so that would be potentially a major defect, because without either of those, there's no way of one tenant enforcing covenants against another tenant, which could cause problems. Inadequate insurance provisions, so we need to make sure that the insurance cover is sufficient to replace the full property, so for the full reinstatement value of the property, all insured risks are covered, any proceeds must be applied towards the reinstatement or repair of the property, and as I say, the landlord is to make up any shortfall out of their own monies. We also need to make sure we have that suspension of rent clause, as I've already mentioned. The other thing is, no obligation on the landlord to perform vacant flat covenants would also be considered as a defect. So where a flat is unoccupied or hasn't been sold, there should be a covenant on the landlord to perform the tenant's covenants in respect to that property. If you don't have that, the property could fall into disrepair, for example, but also the contributions towards service charge by other flats may go up because the vacant flat's share may well be distributed amongst the occupying tenants, and that just wouldn't be fair. So the landlord should cover that vacant flat in terms of both covenants to repair and things, but also their share of service charge. And a flying freehold is always unacceptable to lenders. So this often occurs where you have, for example, two masonette leases, with each person being the freeholder of the other. So masonette, so you have one flat on top of the other, and so the bottom flat owns the freehold of the top, and vice versa. So hence the term flying freehold. Completely unacceptable because you haven't got control in that situation of what's going on above you or below you, and that can obviously affect the property. So if you've got a scenario like that, then the freehold of that property should be vested in both of those masonettes, for example, under a single title or under a company, so that they own the freehold together, or a company owns the freehold, and that gives you a degree of control back. Now, I said I'd come back to title, and there's just a couple of bits of statute really to flag up to you. The first one is to do with unregistered freehold and Section 44 of the Law of Property Act 1925, and Section 44 says that a buyer cannot insist on seeing details of the freehold title. Now, that could obviously be a problem where the lease has to be sent to the land registry for first registration, because if we don't send in details of the freehold, the class of title that you're going to get on registration of the lease would only be good leasehold title. So you would want, and obviously remember what I said earlier about the standard conditions, and I'll come back to that in a second, but if you're not dealing with the standard conditions, then you would need a special condition in the contract saying that the seller has to deduce title to the freehold to assist you in that situation. Now, where the title is registered freehold, there's no restrictions on the rights of the parties to the contract to make their own arrangements as to what title to deduce, but in any event, it's an open register. So, because the title is registered at the land registry, buyer's solicitor can easily just get a typed copy of the register as a title if the seller doesn't provide them, so that's not such a difficult situation to deal with. In terms of an underlease, so a sublease if you like, Section 44, again, of the LPA, prohibits a call for the superior leasehold and freehold titles. So in other words, you're not entitled to see either of the titles above the sublease. So if you're dealing with a sublease, again, you should always make sure you get a copy of all of the superior titles where they are unregistered before the new sublease is granted, because otherwise you're going to have problems again because you can't see the titles above the lease that you're getting. Again, where you're dealing with a registered lease and you're getting a sublease from that registered lease, you haven't got the same problem because, again, official copies of title are open to public inspection at the land registry, and you can easily get official copies of both the freehold title and the superior leasehold title direct from the land registry. So it's not such a problem. Now, as I said before, I mentioned the standard condition earlier, I'm just going to mention it again. Standard condition 8.2.4 helps us here, because if the new lease, whichever one it is, whether it's a grant of a new lease or a sublease, if that new lease is registrable, then the seller must deduce title to the buyer to enable the buyer to register their own lease with title absolutely with the land registry. So as long as your lease that you're getting is over 7 years in length, and you're using the standard conditions, you're not going to have those problems that are caused by the Law of Property Act 1925. If the lease term is less than 7 years, though, then you may well have that problem if you're not using the standard conditions, so make sure you have those special conditions put in the contract saying that the seller has to deduce title to you. Now, I would say regardless, if you're ever taking a lease before you even get to the point of kind of exchange, you should always insist on seeing all the superior titles anyway, because you're investigating title, that's what you need to do. I don't think this is a huge problem you're going to encounter, because what we're talking about here is long residential leases. They're always going to be over 7 years, they're always going to be registrable, and we use the standard conditions in pretty much all of our transactions, but it is just something to be aware of. In terms of completion, just a couple of things to point out. Where it comes to leasehold conveyancing, your completion statement will include apportionments of rent and service charge, and that may also include the insurance premium contributions. So where there's a grant of a new lease, apportionments need to be made from the day of completion up until the next payment date, so that will likely be the next quarter day. And on the granting of a new lease, the landlord will sign one part and the tenant will sign the counterpart of the original lease, and those original lease and counterpart will be exchanged on completion so that the other party, so each party I should say, retains the other party's signed part, if you like. And then lastly, just to deal with post-completion. Stamp duty land tax is payable, obviously, if you exceed the threshold for stamp duty in leasehold transactions, exactly the same way as freehold. So the stamp duty here, though, is calculated slightly differently because it is based not only on the purchase price of that property, that lease, so the premium, but also the length of term and the rent that's payable under it. Rather than going into the calculation with you, the easiest thing by far to do is to use the online calculator with Revenue and Customs. You input all of the details in relation to the lease and it calculates the amount of stamp duty land tax that's payable. In exactly the same way as freehold, you will get the SDLT5 certificate from Revenue and Customs, and that needs to be sent to the land registry with your application for registration. So it's no different, but the actual calculation of stamp duty is slightly different than freehold. As said already, if your lease is for a term of more than 7 years, it's compulsory registrable at the land registry. Leases under that term don't have to be registered, but they can voluntarily be done so. But here, we're talking about leases of more than 7 years, so you're going to be dealing with registration. And then the last thing is notice of dealing. So where a lease has been granted and the tenant has had mortgage finance to purchase that lease, then it's likely the landlord will want notice of that mortgage under a provision in the lease. So I mentioned earlier about notices of dealing to know what's going on with the property. Now, even if that's not a requirement in the lease, it's good practice to send the landlord notice of the mortgage, and some lenders will insist on it. So what you do is you send the landlord notice of the mortgage in duplicate, and you ask them to return one copy of the notice receipted. Some lenders may require that receipted notice to be sent to them, along with a copy of the property's title showing that their mortgage has been registered. Others may just want you to keep that on file. So that concludes today's lecture on leaseholds and the granting of a new lease. As I say, buying and selling an existing lease will be dealt with within the next lecture.